In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about folk and pop culture. First, let's talk about what culture is. Culture can be reflected in material traits, customary beliefs, social forms, and traditions of groups of people. We notice that all of these things can make groups of people distinctive in different parts of the world. Culture can influence behavior by means of custom and habit. A custom is a repetitive act of a group performed to the extent that it becomes a characteristic of that group. A habit is a repetitive act that a particular individual performs. When we look at culture, we can divide that in two different categories, folk culture and pop culture. When we talk about folk culture, we're talking about traditional groups that are small, homogeneous, and typically live in rural areas. Pop culture is made up of groups of heterogeneous societies. That means that they're much more diverse. They also share a lot of different habits despite the differences in their personal characteristics. So just to clarify, folk culture is going to be more persistent in rural areas and pop culture is going to be more persistent in urban areas. When we look at culture and we try to determine whether or not we're looking at folk culture or pop culture, we're going to take a look at daily necessities like food, clothing, and shelter. We can also look at some of the leisure activities like what do people do for art and recreation. Let's take a look at the origin of both folk and pop culture. In folk culture, usually there's an anonymous hearth, meaning that the origin or the source or dates of when that culture first began are unknown. There also is the potential for multiple hearths to have impacted that folk culture, and each are independent, also anonymous. Pop culture, on the other hand, is typically traceable to a specific person, corporation, or place. Most often, a product of pop culture is something that comes out of developed countries like North America or Europe. Now that we looked at origin, let's look at how these cultures diffuse. Folk culture diffuses differently than pop culture. When we look at the diffusion of folk culture, it's transmitted slowly from one location to another and on a very small scale. This primarily happens with relocation diffusion as people are moving to a different place. Pop culture, on the other hand, diffuses very fast and extensively from identifiable hearths or nodes. The reason why pop culture is able to travel so fast is because of modern communication technology and hierarchical diffusion. Remember that in hierarchical diffusion, that could be diffused by the influence of a government, another form of bureaucracy, a corporation, or a famous person. Now looking at the distribution of culture. In folk culture, it's a combination of physical and cultural factors that influence the distribution. With pop culture, it's widely distributed across many countries with little regard for physical factors. It's also influenced by the ability of people to access the material elements. And the biggest obstacle to pop culture access is lack of income. Also, when you think about where people might be living, if they're in rural areas, these are all going to be things that are going to impact whether or not they have access to that. There are definitely geographic differences between folk and pop culture. Folk culture regions are usually a lot smaller and they're not as connected to other parts of the world, whereas pop culture is very much connected to other parts of the world. If different folk cultures live closer in proximity to each other, they can actually influence one another, and one folk culture might be able to adopt some of the practices of the other culture, but this has become less apparent today because pop culture is much more impactful. We learn a lot about culture through music, and there is a big difference between music reflected in folk culture versus pop culture. In folk culture, music may reflect stories of ancestors, may also tell a little bit more about messages of the life cycle or customs related to marriage, death, or birth. For example, in Vietnam, they used a song to convey information about farming. Where folk culture is more about telling stories and can be much more reflective of that unique culture, pop culture is very different. Music in pop culture is typically written by individuals for the purpose of being sold or performed for a large amount of people. Currently, when we look at the music today, there's a high degree of technological skill to create a beat for a song through a manipulation of sounds. And different music is popular in different areas because of taste and not access. Recreational activities also look different in both folk and pop culture. Let's take a look at soccer or football. Well, I suppose Americans call it soccer, but to the rest of the world, it's known as football. But looking at the folk origins of soccer, we know that it was initially a folk sport in England during the 11th century. Also, its origins are obscure, like most folk customs. Soccer eventually diffused as a popular culture sport because we see it played all over the world. The rise from folk sport to popular sport began in the 1800s, and it began with clubs being formed for the enjoyment of factory workers during leisure time. Eventually, the leisure time turned into people viewing soccer being played, and then it turned into football clubs being formed where soccer was played, and then nowadays we have the World Cup. And so that is the biggest reflection of how it's become a pop culture sport. Other surviving folk sports include cricket, which is primarily played in the UK and former British colonies. So it's really popular in India, for example. Ice hockey logically relies in colder climates such as northern US or Canada. And then for baseball, that was once only in North America, but it was introduced to the Japanese through foreign exchange students from Japan who went home and shared it with the rest of the country. So it's a huge sport, the most popular sport in Japan. Let's take a moment to look at material folk culture and pop culture. So these are the material things that we can look at that are very distinctive and different and give us a sense of what a culture may look like. So the three most distinctive material culture elements include clothing, food, and shelter. Material elements of folk culture are typically unknown because the origins of that culture are unknown. But typically the material elements diffuse slowly through relocation diffusion. With material elements of pop culture, those vary more in time than they do in place. So when we look at pop culture, think about styles that were really popular in the 70s or the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and then today. And think about how those styles can look very different even from a year before when things are out of season. These material elements diffuse rapidly across Earth and can be attributed to either a person or a company. There may be times that folk and pop culture conflict when they meet, and so conflicts can arise between folk and pop culture in specific countries. Wearing folk clothing in countries dominated by pop culture can be controversial and vice versa. One prime example is expressing religious belief in public. For example, in countries like France and Belgium, they prohibit women from wearing a hijab, niqab, a burqa, and a chador in schools or public jobs. Many around the world protest this restriction because they believe that it is a violation of religious freedom and that it targets specific religious groups. Let's also look at the reasons that people wear clothing in folk culture versus pop culture. When we look at folk culture, people living in folk cultures have worn traditional clothing in response to climatic conditions and maybe agricultural practices. In pop culture, on the other hand, rather than clothing being dictated by climate or agriculture, it may be dictated more so by preference that could reflect either occupation or work. One example of how folk clothing could be reflected in climate would be from the Netherlands, where people wear wooden shoes. Although it seems really bizarre, it actually has a very practical use in wet climates. Sometimes folk clothing can even become a feature of pop culture. So for example, increased travel and improved connection has opened North Americans and Europeans to traditional clothing, just like how others have come in contact with Western clothing. An example of this is the poncho. And the poncho is from South America and Nigeria, but has diffused to other places in the world over a large period of time. There are two things that can impact whether or not someone has access to pop culture clothing, and that is occupation. So, for example, a doctor in New York would be more likely to dress like a doctor in New York than a factory worker in New York. And then, of course, when we're looking at income as well, clothing fashion will typically change from time to time. So, for social purposes, people are going to have a sufficient income to be able to change consistently their wardrobes. Food is another material item that can give us a reflection of distinctive culture. We can determine these distinctions through food preferences or social, religious, and ethnic ideals. The first element of food is the environment, and we know that inhabitants of a region must consider multiple factors when they decide to produce particular foods. Think about a terroir, for example, and so this is the contribution of a location's distinctive physical features to the way that food tastes. The most common way that we think of this term is as it applies to wine. So when you hear about people tasting wine and saying that it tastes really earthy or fruity, that has a lot to do with the terroir or the environment that may be contributing to that flavor. There are also taboos that are attached to social or religious customs, and that's a restriction on behavior imposed by that custom. So, for example, Muslims do not eat pork and Hindus do not eat cattle meat, particularly beef. Food in pop culture is mainly reflected by values rather than environmental features. Fast food has become very popularized around the world due to globalization. There are some distinctive regional differences in food that we can see in the United States. For example, some cultural factors would include Texans eating tortilla chips or Californians drinking a lot of wine. Or the Midwest eating a lot of McDonald's, which there's no clear connection as to that, but we do see some patterns. This map you see here will indicate the different regions of the United States and what kind of fast food is most popular in that region. I think it's definitely fair to say that among all those fast food chains, that In-N-Out is most popular on the West Coast. Access to folk and pop culture is very unequal. Let's talk about why. Television has been very influential in the diffusion of pop culture for two main reasons. Watching TV is the most popular leisure activity in the world. Also, TV has been the most important mechanism for diffusing pop culture across the globe. There are three main phases we can see here when looking at the diffusion of television. In the first map, we see the first wave of TVs becoming more prominent in homes in North America. And this is in, again, the 1950s. In the second phase, in the 1970s, we see it spread to the East, primarily Europe, and South America, as well as the South Pacific. And then in the 2000s, we see it far more spread to different parts of the world, including developing regions of the world as well. The diffusion of the internet has allowed for pop culture to diffuse even more rapidly than television did. Check out the internet in the 1990s. You see it pretty prominent in North America and Europe. Look at where it spreads by 2000. Then look how much more it spreads by 2014. Social media has expanded that even more. Even though it is a component of the internet, it shows how connected people around the world are. As you will see in the following slide, social media originates in the US, following the same trend as TV and internet. Since social media is constantly evolving, we can't conclude that the US is going to remain the leader in new innovations. Looking at the topic of sustainability, folk culture experiences the biggest threat. With pop culture spreading so fast, many folk cultures are starting to undergo assimilation. A unique culture, the Amish, has been able to acculturate, meaning they've adjusted to the dominant culture while still keeping their folk culture. Pop culture also threatens the environment through landscape pollution and natural resource depletion. Pop culture can also threaten the unique landscape that might be distinctive to certain cultures. For the purposes of sales, a lot of pop culture is spread by creating uniform landscapes. Sometimes decisions are made for what land will be used for. And when it comes to pop culture, an example of this would be using a great agricultural piece of land to create a golf course of 200 acres. This requires a lot of water and grass to maintain its beauty, and it's not necessarily the best use of the land itself. This is the end of the lesson on the difference between folk and pop culture.